Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The subcommittee will come to order. I'm Leonard Lance, the vice chair of the subcommittee, and I have the honor of chairing the subcommittee today. The Subcommittee on Communications and Technology will now come to order. I thank our witnesses for being here. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. Since the inception of 911 as the nationwide emergency telephone number in 1968, 911 call centers around the country have saved countless lives by giving the public a quick and easy way to request assistance in times of emergency. Technological advances over the years, such as geolocation, have opened up opportunities to improve upon the system, allowing law enforcement officers to receive the approximate location of where a call has originated. In order to keep up with the times, many states have established a fee or tax to upgrade and maintain their 911 systems. These funds are especially crucial as we look to next-gen 911 to update significantly the capabilities of our emergency communications. Innovations such as text to 911 and the ability for citizens to send law enforcement officials real-time video during an emergency have the potential to revolutionize our emergency communications and save even more lives. Under the new and emerging Technologies 911 Improvement Act of 2008, the Federal Communications Commission is required to submit a report to Congress on state collection and distribution of 911 and enhanced 911 fees and charges. These reports have shed light on a handful of states that have been raiding these 911 fees and diverting the funds for unrelated purposes. This unacceptable practice leaves counties and localities on the hook for maintaining and upgrading their systems. And this, of course, endangers public safety. Since 2004, New Jersey, where I live, has collected a 90-cent tax on consumers' monthly telephone and cell phone bills for 911 improvements. However, New Jersey has become the worst 911 fee diverter in the country, diverting over $1 billion to non-911 related purposes. Quite simply, this is unacceptable. Our constituents need to know that in an emergency, their 911 call is going to go through. Lawmakers in state capitals, including Trenton and in several other state capitals around the country, have raided the funds set aside to improve the 911 system and left the account penniless, leaving public safety threatened and local taxpayers on the hook, as I have said. I oppose the original legislation in New Jersey because it opened the door to the diversion as we are seeing today. And this has been regardless of which party has controlled the governorship in the state I represent. Now New Jersey lawmakers are considering an increase on the tax to fund next-gen 911. Instead of further taxing New Jerseyans, Trenton should first stop diverting existing fees from their intended use. I'm pleased to welcome Jim Curry to our panel today. Mr. Curry is the Division of Communications Director for Hunterdon County's Department of Public Safety and Health Services. Hunterdon County is one of 21 counties in New Jersey, and I personally live in Hunterdon County. Last month, Mr. Curry and the rest of the staff at the 911 Communications Center were kind enough to give me a tour of the facility, and we were joined by Commissioner Mike O'Reilly of the Federal Communications Commission. Commissioner O'Reilly has been a leader in the effort to stop states from diverting, and certainly I think we give him great credit in that regard. The work that's being done is truly remarkable, and I was extremely impressed with the operation as it was ongoing. Despite receiving little to no funds from the state 911 fee fund, Hunterdon County has managed to maintain a state-of-the-art system. However, because the state has been diverting the fees in such a dramatic amount, counties in New Jersey are left to their own devices. These funds generally come from residents' property taxes, which are already among the highest in the nation. That is why I have joined Congressman Collins and Congresswoman Eshoo in introducing the 911 Fee Integrity Act, which would direct the FCC to establish legitimate uses for 911 fees to be directed. And obviously this is bipartisan in nature. Congresswoman Eshoo is a very distinguished senior member of the committee on the Democratic side. I commend Commissioner O'Reilly and Commissioner Rosenworcel for working hard at the FCC, again in a bipartisan capacity, to bring to light the actions of these few bad actor states. However, the Commission's ability to combat diversion is limited. This bipartisan common sense legislation will enable the FCC to ensure that bad actors such as New Jersey are no longer able to divert funds. I commend the members of the subcommittee for their fine work in drafting these important pieces of legislation, and I thank our distinguished panel for appearing before us today. I look forward to the testimony, and I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Doyle. Mr. Doyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. Public safety communications and the integrity of our 911 system is of paramount importance to our nation. Ensuring that life-saving aid gets to those in need in time often comes down to a fast, well-coordinated response by local first responders, something our witnesses deal with every day. This process often starts when a person in need picks up their phone to call for help. This subcommittee is examining 3 pieces of legislation today. Mr. Lance and Ms. Eshoo have introduced legislation regarding 911 fee diversion. This is a practice where a small number of states divert fees intended to fund and upgrade 911 call centers to other non-related public safety programs. This bill seeks to further direct and clarify the FCC's efforts to investigate and report on this practice. The second piece of legislation was introduced by Mr. Engel and Mr. Kinzinger regarding swatting, a malicious and deadly practice where individuals use weaknesses in the phone network to conceal their identity and report a false event that warrants a large-scale police response. Such incidents require full-scale responses that take time and money away from departments tasked with protecting the public. Like many here, I've read too many stories of how these incidents can go bad as well, with SWAT teams being prepared to deal with extremely dangerous situations only to come across confused and frightened individuals who have been targeted by these swatting attacks. Too many times, innocent people have lost their lives because of these malicious, deceptive calls. Our colleague, Congresswoman Clark, has herself been a victim of swatting. I'm happy to once again support my colleague, Mr. Engel's bill to rein in this dangerous practice. This bill was voice voted out of committee in the last Congress, and I hope that we can do so again. I hope as the committee examines this issue that we continue our due diligence. Increasing the penalties for this offense is important, but we need to strengthen our telecommunications systems to ensure that the people calling 911, and to be honest, calling all of us, are who they say they are. Every day I get calls from fake numbers claiming to come from my neighborhood. We cannot ultimately curb swatting until our phone systems can do a better job at identifying and blocking fake numbers. I would urge the majority and the chairman to keep this in mind if they hope to address this underlying issue. Finally, we are looking at a bill introduced by Mrs. Brooks and Ms. Eshoo regarding the establishment of a national non-emergency short dialing code. In Pittsburgh, like many cities, 311 is that number. Residents in Pittsburgh can use it to report a downed tree, a building code violation, or in my city, all too often, a pothole on a city street. This service gives residents a valuable line to the city and municipal agencies where they can report important but non-emergency incidents. Properly implemented, this service can reduce the burden on 911 operators and call centers, allowing them to focus more fully on responding to real emergency situations. I hope we can advance this legislation as well. And while I think these bills should be able to move in our committee, I'm very concerned that this hearing is titled Solutions to Strengthen U.S. Public Safety Communications. None of these bills, nor the committee's other efforts, have gone far enough to address many of the underlying challenges facing this sector, in my opinion. As the witnesses pointed out, public safety agencies need a strong federal partner to ensure that they have the technology and solutions deployed to meet the needs of our country. I'd like to submit for the record an article from the New York Times Magazine that was published last month regarding one family's horrific experience in Houston during Hurricane Harvey. The family couldn't get a medevac via 911, so they resorted to calling their congressman, Gene Green, a member of this committee, where an intern answered the phone and helped to direct a helicopter rescue. The 911 system was clearly overwhelmed, and was not nearly robust or resilient enough to tackle the volume of calls or the multiple storm-related equipment and facility failures that occurred. And none of this is in any way intended to diminish the brave and courageous efforts of so many volunteers who came to their neighbors' aid in this disaster and so many others. But for the richest, most powerful nation on earth, we can and should do better, Mr. Chairman. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Doyle. The chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Walden of Oregon, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome our witnesses. Thanks both for your help this morning in giving us your guidance and counsel and the service you provide in your states and communities. We have a legislative hearing where we'll be discussing 3 important bipartisan public safety bills. 2 weeks ago, we remembered the sacrifices and the heroism of the September 11th attacks. Ceremonies across our nation reminded us not just of those Americans we lost, but also of the hard work our public safety community does day in and day out to keep us safe. This is evident again as our first responders manage the consequences of various hurricanes, including especially Hurricane Florence. Whether at home or at school, our children learned at an early age that when an emergency strikes, you dial 911. But like the technology systems, our 911 systems must be preserved and improved to deliver potentially life-saving services reliably and seamlessly when called upon. This committee worked in a bipartisan manner in Congress to enact improved rural call completion, so the call actually will go through. Also, we passed Carey's Law. That ensures that when we dial 911, no matter where we are, including a hotel room, that the call will go through without the need to dial another number. With rules finally approved for NTIA and NHTSA to move forward on distributing funds for Next Gen 911, I'm pleased these dollars will be finding their way to localities. Whether it's these dollars or the much larger share of fees collected on your phone bill, we have a duty to ensure that the 6,000 public safety answering points, or PSAPs, nationwide that manage our 911 systems are actually receiving these vital funds. Unfortunately, we have found that some states have diverted their 911 funds that were assessed for this specific purpose. We have seen states divert funding directly into their general funds, while others use the money for another public safety-related purpose that may have nothing to do with the 911 system. The result is the same. PSAPs aren't getting the money they are promised. And I would just say as an aside, I would guess that would be a fraud for most people other than the government. That if you collected a fee for an intended purpose and you put it in writing and sent it through the mail and then you diverted the funds for some other purpose, my guess is if you weren't the government, you'd be facing a prosecutor. So today we'll discuss H.R. 6424, the 911 Fee Integrity Act, which would clarify for states and municipalities that funds raised for 911, paid by users of 911, and phones are only spent on 911. We'll also discuss H.R. 5700, Ms. Brooks' National Non-Emergency Mobile Number Act. While the FCC designated 911 as the nation's emergency number more than 50 years ago, the 911 system is sometimes used unnecessarily in non-emergencies. So in order to preserve 911 services for true emergencies and to ensure limited public safety resources are not used unnecessarily, some states have adopted an easy-to-remember short code that the public can dial to reach public safety officials in non-emergency situations. However, there's no unified short code. So a traveler traveling from Colorado to Oregon might be able to dial star 277 in Colorado, pound 4357 in Wyoming, star 477 throughout Idaho, and finally, there's no short code in Oregon. So that's a lot to keep track of. Ms. Brooks' bill would make things a whole bunch easier, and we appreciate her diligent work on this issue, directing the FCC to set up a unified short code that states could choose and then adopt. Finally, we'll be discussing H.R. 6003. That's Mr. Engel's Anti-Swatting Act. This should be a familiar bill, given that we approved by voice vote this bill last Congress. Swatting is the act of using misleading or inaccurate caller ID information with an intent to trigger a law enforcement response where no real emergency exists. Swatting is dangerous, it's a drain on precious resources, and it's illegal. Unfortunately, swatting incidents remain a problem and continue to put law enforcement and innocent bystanders in harm's way. Mr. Engel's bill would stiffen criminal penalties against those who are convicted of swatting and bolster our public safety officials' ability to serve and to protect. So collectively, the bipartisan bills to be discussed today will help improve, they will help strengthen the 911 system and enhance public safety across the country. So I want to thank our witnesses for being here today, and I'd also say that it was this committee several years ago that passed the legislation that set up the spectrum auction that has funded and helped get in place FirstNet. And we intend to continue to do our due diligence to oversee the implementation of FirstNet to make sure that it actually delivers on the promise that our first responders will have an interoperable public safety network that works for them. And so we've done a lot out of this committee, mostly in bipartisan way. We appreciate your being here today. Got 3 more important bills to look at. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The chair now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Pallone of New Jersey, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today we're here to talk about ways to support public safety and our nation's first responders. America asks so much of our emergency workers, and the least we can do is make sure they have the best and most up-to-date tools to do their jobs. I'd like to thank our panel for the work they do every day helping Americans in times of crisis and distress. It seems almost every week we're reminded of the critical role first responders play in keeping people safe. Last week, we watched as first responders along the Carolina coast rescued people trapped in their homes as rising waters made it nearly impossible to escape. Emergency communications is critical in such times. If 911 calls are not completed, emergency responders will not arrive. And that's why it's so important that Congress enacted my Sandy Act earlier this year to help ensure our critical communications networks have access to the resources they need to stay online during a disaster. Beyond calls from the public to 911 dispatchers, if police or firefighters can't communicate with each other during a crisis, their lives and the lives of the public are put at risk. And this committee, on a bipartisan basis, passed legislation to create a nationwide broadband communications network dedicated to public safety. What resulted is FirstNet. While early in its rollout, the network promises to make first responders across the country safer and help them with their work. FirstNet's an important step, but more must be done to help public safety. Today's hearing considers some important issues. I've long criticized states, including my own in New Jersey, of diverting 911 fees. As Mr. Curry will explain, it's expensive to operate a 911 center, and it's important that they are fully funded. States should also be upgrading centers to be Next Generation 911 capable. Next Generation 911 will enable the public to transmit images, video, and text to 911 centers where operators will be able to process and pass this information to first responders. And this is extremely valuable information, but the cost will be significant. Last year, every Democrat on the committee co-sponsored the Lift America Act, which makes key investments in our nation's infrastructure, including helping to fund the deployment of Next Generation 911. In addition, Representatives Eshu, Torres, and I introduced the Next Generation 911 Act of 2017, which expands the federal NG 911 grant program. These are common sense proposals that we should be able to work on together. In the coming year, I urge my colleagues to work with me on legislation to upgrade our nation's infrastructure, including our public safety systems. I'd also like to recognize the important efforts of Mr. Engel to fight swatting, fake emergency calls to dispatch police to an address where no emergency is occurring. This is really dangerous. It puts innocent lives at risk and burdens already stretched police resources. So Congress must provide law enforcement the tools to stop such malicious acts. And I'd like now to yield the remaining 2 minutes to, well, I guess he's not here yet, Mr. Engel, right? I think he's at his Foreign Affairs Committee. So I would at this point yield the balance of my time.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member. Are there any other members of the committee who would like to have an opening statement? Seeing none, this concludes member opening statements. The chair reminds members that pursuant to the committee rules, all members' opening statements will be made part of the record. We want to thank our witnesses for being here today, and we appreciate your taking the time to testify before the subcommittee. Today's witnesses will have the opportunity to give opening statements, followed by a round of questions from members. Our panel for today's hearings will include Mr. Eddie Reyes, Director of Public Safety Communications for Prince William County, Mr. Jim Curry, the Division Head of the Communications Division of the Hunterdon County Department of Public Safety, and Captain Paul Starks, the Director of the Public Information Office at the Montgomery County Police Department. We appreciate the fact, gentlemen, that you are here today. Before the committee, we know you have important responsibilities in your jurisdictions, and we're honored that you're in Washington. We'll begin with Mr. Reyes. You are recognized, sir, for 5 minutes for the purposes of an opening statement. Good morning to you.
Thank you, Mr. Lance. Chairman Blackburn, Ranking Member Doyle, Mr. Lance, thank you for giving me this opportunity to testify before you today. It is an honor and a privilege to be selected to represent the 911 community at this hearing and be a part of this bipartisan process. I'm the Director of Office of Public Safety Communications in Prince William County, Virginia, one of the nation's approximately 5,800 public safety answering points, which has been recognized as PSAPs. They're also known as Emergency Communication Centers or 911 centers. ECCs like the one I lead answer more than 240 million calls every year in the United States. That's roughly about 657,000 calls per day. Prior to becoming the ECC director in Prince William County, I was a police officer in Alexandria, Virginia for 25 years. I retired as a senior deputy chief and second in command of the police department. I worked in almost every unit of the police department, and I was ECC director in 2001 during the September 11th attack at the Pentagon and during the 3 weeks in 2002 when the Beltway sniper gripped the entire national capital region with fear. I'm also the chairman of the International Association of Chiefs of Police Communications and Technology Committee. A few statistics about Prince William County's Emergency Communications Center. In addition to serving almost 500,000 residents in the county, we provide a wireless 911 service and dispatch for police, fire, and rescue personnel to 5 smaller municipalities within our county. We're also part of the National Capital Region, which has a population of over 6 million residents. Public safety organizations in the NCR coordinate extensively to make sure area residents receive high-quality emergency response across the region. Mutual aid is an hourly thing for us. My center has just over 100 employees that receive and process approximately 409,000 calls per year, in which 154 of those were emergencies and 254,000 were non-emergencies. Of the 409,000 calls for service that we received, about 251,000 were for police and 44,000 were for fire and rescue. The largest difference between the number of calls received and those dispatched are that they all come from a smartphone. I'll transition over to the bill that I'm most passionate about, and that's H.R. 6003. I've spoken to 911 center directors or staff, law enforcement officers, and major associations such as APCO and NENA, and all of them support this bill. Even before the FBI coined the term 911 swatting across the country, we've been fighting this complex and ever-evolving threat to public safety. It would just be repetitive for me to mention a lot of the things that have already been said about swatting other than ditto and we agree. So this is very, very important to us. Next, I'll transition over to House Bill 6424, and that while almost everyone in the 911 industry is in favor of this bill, provided it eliminates the big loophole, lack of audit, accountability, and enforcement mechanism to the offending states. As has already been reported, there are offending states like New Jersey, West Virginia, and others that are known to public safety and 911 centers for diverting funds. And I can tell you that as a proud resident of the Commonwealth of Virginia, we know how important it is not to divert funds. So I very much support that bill as well. Regarding 5700, H.R. 5700, this bill caused the greatest quantity and discussion and disagreement among all that I spoke with. While some were supportive, the addition of public safety non-emergency shortcode for mobile users can bring unintended consequence to emergency communication centers, significantly increasing call volume without considering additional staffing. So statistics demonstrate that 911 has been a problem caused by too many non-emergency calls. So in closing, I'd like to take a brief moment to thank you, to thank Representative Schmiskas and Eshu for joining with their co-chairs of the Next Gen 911 Caucus to send a bipartisan letter to the Office of Management and Budget to revise the standard occupational classification to accurately represent the life-saving nature of the work performed by 911 professionals. 911 professionals work behind the scenes to protect the lives of first responders. I'm very grateful for the attention this committee has given to these very important bills to public safety in general, but most importantly to emergency telecommunicators. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your distinguished testimony. Mr. Curry, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning.
Good
Vice
morning.
Chairman Lance, members of the committee, thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak with you today. It is an honor and privilege to take part in this hearing and be a part of this great nation's legislative process. I am the division head for the Hunterdon County Communications Center in New Jersey, the first county 911 system to operate in that state. Prior to my current position, I was a police officer for 27 years and retired at the rank of captain. I've spent my entire professional career in public emergency service without regret. Like many counties in New Jersey, Hunterdon County is a mix of suburban and rural communities with many bucolic hamlets and villages. It is dotted with preserved farmland, numerous acres of parkland, and 2 recreational reservoirs. Interstate 78, a major highway and artery for the port of Newark and Elizabeth, divides the county in half, north and south. The Communications Center is the sole provider of emergency communications for each municipal police department, fire department, and EMS agency in the county. All totaled, we dispatch for about 60 organizations. Daily, we average a little over 100 911 calls, or about 38,000 a year. This is carried out by 25 dedicated full-time public safety telecommunicators, commonly referred to as dispatchers. These men and women are never seen, always heard, and seldom recognized. They work nights, weekends, and holidays, and like our first responders, they can't stay home because the weather is bad. Day in and day out, they speak to folks who are having the worst day of their lives. For some of those callers, the dispatcher is the last human voice they will hear. If you ask the dispatchers why they keep doing the job, most will answer because they enjoy it. They enjoy making a difference. I live and work in the state of New Jersey. It is a fantastic state. Beaches, mountains, entertainment venues, New York City and Philadelphia, all within a short drive from most anywhere in the state. Its marine ports, colleges, and universities, all within a short drive from most anywhere in the state, and businesses also make it a great place to live and work. New Jersey is a major hub of global economy. Unfortunately, but deservedly, it is also known as a heavily taxed state. We in New Jersey have come to enjoy top-shelf services, especially the emergency service we receive. After all, you get what you pay for. Well, maybe not always. I was requested to appear today before this committee to discuss H.R. 6424, the 911 Fee Integrity Act. Because in my state, when you pay certain fees on your phone bills called 911 fees, it doesn't finance what one might expect. According to the New Jersey Association of Counties and New Jersey Wireless Association, the state collects approximately $120 million annually in consumer surcharges as 911 system and emergency response fees and deposits into a trust fund. However, according to the FCC, since 2006, only 11% of the $1.3 billion collected has been spent on eligible expenses. None of the money has been used to fund those eligible expenses at the 911 level, local 911 level. To provide an example, last year we completed an upgrade to our 911 phone system. It wasn't voluntary. The old system was no longer supported. At a cost of $600,000, the project was paid for using capital improvement funds, in other words, taxpayer money. Those taxpayers may have thought they subsidized it when they paid their phone bills, but actually they paid for it twice. Operating a 911 center is expensive. In 2016, our overall budget exceeded $2.25 million. This year, our operating budget alone was $310,000. The cost to maintain our 911 system will devour well over 1/3 of that. The remainder will be spent on radio equipment, tower and generator maintenance, site security, and a host of other essential expenses. We look forward to the day when next generation 911 is realized in New Jersey. It will enable the public to transmit text, images, video, and data to our center. A frequent saying by one of our technicians, Matt Tambor, is, "This isn't like what you see on television," and it isn't. The reality is dispatchers try to find a caller's location by manual entries and interrogation. We don't know what the associated costs will be for us for next generation 911, and I dodge the constant barrage of vendors daily willing to sell us their products that will get us through until the arrival of next generation 911. Those wares come with a hefty price tag. Even in just a small 911 center like ours, the cost can exceed $35,000 annually. I could ramble on about the 911 funding needs of the Hunterdon County Communications Center, but I would prefer to conclude with the importance of 911. When a caller requests the police, they understand that officer may be on another call. When that caller dialed 911, they expect it to be answered immediately and by a well-trained professional. The police may work shorthanded for a shift, but the 911 seat must be occupied. This month, we remembered the tragic events of 9/11, and just a few miles to our south, the effects of a major hurricane continues to wreak havoc on tens of thousands of people's lives. When citizens are faced with a situation beyond their own capabilities, they will dial 911. Those 3 digits are the same for everyone, and it does not discriminate. Perhaps we can do without electricity for a short while, but we must have a robust 911 lifeline infrastructure. Likewise, the dispatchers need the tools to accomplish their mission of helping others and saving lives. I want to end my statement by publicly thanking the Hunterdon County dispatchers, technicians, and administrative staff. You do make a difference every day. Moreover, I wish to thank this committee for your time and devotion to public service, not only concerning this issue, but for all matters that have and will be decided on in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Curry. The chair now recognizes Captain Starks for 5 minutes. Captain Starks, welcome to the subcommittee.
Thank you, and good morning to distinguished members of this committee. My name is Paul Starks. I'm Director of the Public Information Office with the Montgomery County Police Department, where I've been a cop for 34 years. Our jurisdiction is in Maryland, just across the line and adjacent to the District of Columbia. We live in a time where so many forms of technology have been developed and can be accessed by most people, and we live in a country with a free and open society where a variety of communication paths are available to virtually everyone. Some of these methods to call in a phone call or post or send messages are assigned to and can be traced back to an individual. But some of the steps that are used in some of these methods are not as easily walked back, and therefore it's not as easy to determine the history of access or use. Some of that lends itself to false reporting of in-progress violent crimes that can potentially cause a major response by law enforcement, fire and rescue, and other emergency services providers. That type of false call has been termed swatting. When an individual creates a swatting incident detailing false information that involves an act of violence, sometimes involving a large population group like that of a school, it causes large numbers of personnel to put forth efforts that are not only costly, but also strip an organization and a community of public safety resources. When a message is first received, call takers, dispatchers, and their supervisors become involved in gathering details regarding that call. This event also may take a 911 line out of service while these details are confirmed. Next to be involved are the cops and fire and rescue employees who are taken from their primary responsibilities and direct their attention to the current call. This involves a potentially dangerous, higher speed lights and siren responses and removes public safety personnel from their legitimate duties. Should there be an actual need in that same geographical area, help must come from further away, making someone experiencing a medical emergency or a crime victim wait unnecessarily for potentially life-saving resources. Furthermore, depending on the details of the swatting call, tactical team members, negotiators, and specialty fire and rescue personnel and their equipment are often dispatched to these scenes. When first responders arrive and attempt to contact potential victims and suspects at what is believed to be an active and volatile scene, it becomes potentially dangerous for all parties. At one such encounter in Kansas, this led to an innocent father of 2 being fatally shot by responding law enforcement officers who legitimately believed he was a threat at that scene. Investigation of that event led to a California man being charged with being responsible for the swatting event where the call was initiated. In the recent past, in my jurisdiction, Montgomery County has received multiple swatting calls. One event involved a message claiming that bombs had been planted in a Silver Spring high school, which led to an emergency response by public safety and an evacuation of approximately 2,000 students and staff. This call was ultimately determined to have come from out of state. Fortunately, there were no reported injuries, but resources were deployed. Teaching and learning came to a halt that day, and due to the weather, students and staff had to be housed at other nearby schools and places of worship, causing other disruption. This doesn't begin to address the cost of long-term investigative efforts and also the potential emotional toll taken on students and staff who are affected by these types of calls. In conclusion, I believe this bill is necessary to augment state and local efforts with federal resources to investigate swatting events, and in the end, individuals who initiate these calls will be more easily held responsible by employing appropriate fines, incarceration, and specific cost recovery from suspects for expenses incurred during the response and investigation. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Captain Starks, and to the entire panel, thank you for your public service. I will begin the questioning and recognize myself for 5 minutes. I had the opportunity to tour the 911 call center operated by Mr. Curry in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. It's the county where I live. It's a relatively small county, 130,000 residents. We only have 21 counties in New Jersey with 9 million people, so it's one of our smaller counties. Mr. Curry, how much funding have you received from the state 911 system over the past 10 years? Zero. Where does the majority or perhaps the entirety of your funding come from?
Taxpayer money.
What,
That comes from taxpayer money.
taxpayer money, but not from state coffers. It
No,
comes
it's local property tax.
from the property tax burden. What is your county's long-term plan for upgrading to next-gen 911, given the lack of state funding?
Well, as we wait for the next-gen 911, there are vendors out there that can provide us with software similar to the next-gen 911, but it comes at a very high price tag. So it's questionable if we'll actually be able to afford that. Until then, we'll just continue conducting business as we do.
Thank you. Mr. Reyes, does the public, in your opinion, understand that in some states funds are diverted and that part of their monthly telephone bill is being collected to upgrade these systems when in fact that may not always be the case?
I don't think they understand, but as I said, Mr. Lance, in the Commonwealth of Virginia, that's not so much of a problem. So that's why it has not been a widely publicized issue for that.
You're doing a good job in Virginia.
Well, the elected officials are, sir.
I commend you. And what is the situation in Maryland, in your jurisdiction, Montgomery County? The question relates to the funding that is received. Do you receive funding for these purposes from the state of Maryland?
Some generally. I can't confirm the exact forms or the amounts or percentages.
Thank you. Regarding Congresswoman Brooks' fine legislation, would any member of this distinguished panel care to comment on it and on your views as to how we should move forward regarding Congresswoman Brooks' legislation?
Is that for the cost recovery?
No. On emergency calls. Mr. Reyes?
Yes, I'll start with that, Mr. Lance. So that's a mixed one for us. So while we think that there should be a standard.
I'm 100% for it, but
Okay. So while I think that, it makes sense to come up with a standardized non-emergency number that's across the country, similar to what we have right now for the emergency number, the concern with that is that centers would start to receive a lot more volume and that we wouldn't have sufficient personnel. So I think it's a good idea, providing that there was funding considerations given to additional staffing in the centers.
very, very good. Would any other member of the panel like to comment? Mr. Curry?
Sure, Congressman, thank you. In the state of New Jersey, we have pound 77, which is informally known as a snitch number, which is when you can dial that number in for aggressive drivers, people on cell phones and such. We also have 511, which is another number which gives you an automated
see.
instructions for traffic. So even amongst the state of New Jersey, we have two different numbers that can be confusing.
It's
So
confused. It's confusing.
I would appreciate that in my state.
Captain Starks.
To echo what Mr. Reyes said, that this is a good idea for this national non-emergency code or number, but as long as the staffing is also provided. Before coming here, I spoke with the director of our ECC, and he's for anything that can free up 911 lines for true emergencies and get the non-emergency calls, which every center receives, directed to the non-emergency lines.
Thank you. Without objection, I will enter into the record of the following documents: a letter from the Hunterdon County Freeholders. Freeholders in New Jersey are county commissioners in support of H.R. 6424, the bill I'm sponsoring, and an article on the 911 fee diversion in New Jersey. Without objection, and now I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member, Mr. Doyle of Pittsburgh.
Thank you, Mr. Lance. Snitch number, huh? That's only in Jersey would they call it a snitch number.
Thank you for that very nice compliment, Mr. Ranking Member.
Well, I'll tell you, I like to call that number every time I see someone texting while they're driving their car. So let me ask a question for the entire panel. Maybe we can just start with Mr. Reyes and go forward. You know, as all you are considering the cost of maintaining and upgrading 911 systems to enhance the next generation systems, are you concerned that the current federal, state, and local funding structures are sufficient to deploy a robust and resilient national 911 system? Do any of you believe there's a funding shortfall nationally that may leave many communities behind? What's your thoughts on, or how confident do you feel that the funding exists for you to put that kind of a system in?
So in Virginia, I can tell you that most 911 center directors are grossly under budgeted, and so there's not enough budgeting, especially not for next generation 911. In the National Capital Region, the Northern Virginia center directors are implementing next generation 911 as a region, not so much as an individual, just to take advantage of multiple purchases, reducing the cost. And I can tell you that we are, moving our different priorities around to make sure to accommodate that. At the federal and state level, again, I don't agree that there is sufficient funding being directed towards 911 centers. I think what we would need in order to get that to that level is a bill similar to the bill that brought FirstNet upon for national broadband, give that same level of attention and funding to next generation 911.
Thanks, Mr. Ray. Mr. Curry?
As it stands today, with 89% of the phone bill fees being diverted away, there's obviously not enough money. Only 11% is going towards 911 at all at the state level. I have
This is in New Jersey.
this is in the state of New Jersey, and I have full faith in the state of New Jersey at the 911, at the people who handle 911 at that level, that they can get us next gen 911, but they would need proper funding to do so.
Thank you. Mr. Stark?
Thank you. To save time, I would say similar to what they said, and Montgomery County's specific example is that the funding isn't there right now. We have mandatory overtime for workers there, and there's an incredible turnover. And I don't think that's unique across the country.
Yeah, I would just reiterate to my colleagues, if we want to get this problem solved, it's going to take more resources, and I think there's just no doubt about that. Seems like swatting's only getting more and more commonplace. I get calls all the time that not only my area code, but my local dialing code, and I'm thinking it's somebody, that I know because the number looks familiar, and it's well, you don't know who it is. It's a tape recording or something else saying that they want you to do something, but and I think we see this swatting is putting more and more people at risk every day too, when it involves phony calls that require first responders to do something. The question is, are you all getting concerned that it's getting harder to verify a caller's identity and location? Do you see this as a problem, and are your people experiencing more and more incidents of not being able to correctly identify a caller's name and location?
So in Prince William County, Mr. Doyle, it's difficult to find legitimate callers, people that are calling 911 because they can't breathe, or they're having a robbery in progress, let alone the swatters. The swatters, the experiences that we've had, we had one just a couple months ago at a school, and that person was out of the country. The IP address that was tracked down wasn't even in the United States. And so, of course, even if we were to track that person down, prosecution would be nearly impossible.
Any others have comments on that?
To echo what Mr. Reyes said, excuse me, we had one recently, and we work in I wouldn't say that it's getting harder for us to track the people down, but surely not getting easier, and Next Gen 911 would help us with that. But also to echo the captain as well, for a small center like ours, when we get one of those calls, we don't have a lot of redundant resources in the form of personnel. So when we get a call like that, it's all hands on deck. And it really does detract from somebody else who could possibly be having a legitimate emergency.
Yeah, it's a real problem.
Mr. Doyle, in your opening statements, you used the terms malicious, deadly, and I believe wasteful, and you're dead on there. There's just a ripple effect when these calls come in, and many times it is a larger scale event like a school, but sometimes it's a residence, somebody of some notoriety. In one instance in Montgomery County, it was a national news broadcaster who wasn't home. And dispatchers and good cops who were responding recognized some of the characteristics of this call and really put some information together, determined that this man wasn't even home but was in New York City, made contact with him, and really diverted a lot of resources from coming and stopped a potentially dangerous situation from occurring.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, and the chair now recognizes Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you. Great to have you. Thank you for your service, all of you. I'm going to be pretty brief and short because I think the bills are pretty clear, and I think they identify problems, and we got to move the process forward. But first of all, I just wanted to mention that here across the country and even in Washington D.C., it's kind of all opioids all the time. So we've allowed the naloxone to be administered by first responders in this most recent package. I think we want to obviously have the appropriate training, so I think there's some funding to allow training for that to happen, because we know with that ability to help comes a risk, and we've seen that in the first line responders. So I would ask the associations to keep us posted on what we may be doing to be helpful and what things we're doing that may not be helpful. This fee diversion thing has been a bone of contention with me for a long time. I've been in the 911 debate, especially the cellular side, since I've been a member. And my state was pretty good at first, and then it became bad. And now rumors are that they're labeled as good, but I'm worried about the gaming of the system by states, by filing that they're not diverting, and then as soon as it's been listed that they're not a diversion state, they divert. Do you see any of that gaming going on in the system from your observations? Probably Mr. Curry's probably the best.
You have a right to remain silent, Mr.
I don't know if that's good or
Curry.
bad that you called on me for that. You know, if I sounded too negative about the state of New Jersey, I didn't mean to be. In fact, they're one of the states that, when they were asked, did come forward, and they were truthful in how they do spend the money. I think it's going to just require a constant observation by the FCC.
Well, I think the benefit of my colleague, Mr. Lance's bill, it ensures that states do the right thing. And I think Congressman Lance is right on, or actually Chairman Walden too. We see this in other things when you collect money for a certain purpose and not use it for that purpose. Most average Americans would not get away with what governments are allowed to get away with. So Well, let me ask Ms. Curry on the accounting side. Lost, so for a year, you probably have a projection of what you should receive. And if you don't receive that, is there any hope and expectation that you'll receive it, or is it a loss year by year? It's just gone.
There's never a projection to receive anything. I know every year that from the state I'm going to receive zero.
But you should be able to know, since it's a fee on, don't you have a projection of what you hope to get?
That figure would be what the state takes in, and then how they decide to spend that money would be up to them.
Yeah, I would think that there would be a better way. I guess the way I'm trying to ask the question is, since you don't know what the apportioned amount might be, there's no way that you book hopeful incoming revenue, so that you can't book loss because you never are projecting revenue.
Correct. I never project revenue from the state.
Yeah. I'm sorry. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry to hear that. Let me, I guess the last thing is I represent 33 counties in southern Illinois. So obviously most of them are, yours would be a big county in my congressional district. It'd probably be the biggest county in my congressional district. Having said that, fee diversions for rural small operating systems are probably, would you say there's an exponential challenge for rural because of the cost? You just don't have the numbers. And what about the PSAPs really cover multiple areas, so there may be a cascading event. Is that appropriate to word it that way?
I think what you're asking me, and I hope I'm answering this correctly, there are certain requirements that you must have if you have a 911 center. It doesn't matter if you're a big 911 center or a small 911 center. You have to have a CAD system. You have to have a recorder. You have to continue maintenance on all this equipment. Again, for us, all that money is paid for by the taxpayer. And for these taxpayers, they're paying for it twice.
Yeah. Great. Thank you very much. You'll back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Shimkus. The chair recognizes Mr. McNerney.
Well, I thank the chairman, and I thank the panelists. I'm going to change the subject a little bit, if you don't mind too much. Our nation is facing a growing number of cybersecurity threats. For example, a Miranet botnet that was used in the DDoS attacks, WannaCry that had infiltrated hospital systems, and the Spectre and Meltdown chip vulnerabilities. So it's clear that we need to be more vigilant in protecting against cybersecurity threat. Now, this is especially important in the case when it comes to protecting the safety infrastructure that we have. After all, how can public safety officials protect the public from harm if their own systems are vulnerable to attack? So, Mr. Reyes, would you agree that it's something that we need to be concerned about?
Yes, absolutely, sir. We just had a meeting this week, the 911 center directors in Northern Virginia, Ms. Gordon, who's here representing Alexandria, and that was one of the issues that was on our agenda, and this is where the 911 funds that are given to 911 centers are being diverted. We're talking at the Northern Virginia region how to, as a region, bring about one vendor that can give us the same level of protection across the board. So that is something that's very high up on our agenda, and that we desperately are dedicating funding for protecting our networks, because they're crippling on a regular basis around here, around the Beltway. And you know, the vendors just chalk it up to, we had a network issue, but we know that it's happening way too common for it just to be network issues all the time.
Thank you. Mr. Curry and Mr. Starks, do you also agree?
I agree. I don't have anything to add.
Yes.
Well, what challenges do you face when it comes to protecting your own systems against the potential cyber threats, Mr. Reyes?
Well, it's the same threats and challenges that everyone else faces, including, you know, the Department of Defense, where our networks are constantly being attacked. The threats are growing stronger on a regular basis, but yet, unfortunately, at the local municipal level, we don't have the resources, both in personnel and in funding, to address or tackle those types of constant threats. So we're not in a proactive mode, we're more in a reactive mode. Unfortunately for us, we'd like to see when we're getting an attack to be able to prevent it. Unfortunately, for some of the denials of service that we've witnessed, it's been after the fact, and we'd like to prevent them and try to make sure they don't happen.
Well, I mean, you're talking about some of the steps that you've taken. What are some of the things that you think we in Congress could do to help you better protect your systems?
Well, funding, of course, is always the number one thing. And, and of course, number two is some dedicated federal legislation that when we identify these individuals that are in our home country, be able to put some significant fines and punishment behind these individuals so that it could hopefully serve as a deterrence to others.
Thank you. I also want to talk about wildfires. In Northern California, we've witnessed some devastating wildfires, and it's absolutely critical that first responders have access to information as quickly as possible. Now, in a recent incident, data service was slowed down for first responders battling wildfires, and that's completely unacceptable. The wildfires have also drawn attention to the importance of wireless emergency alerts. So, Mr. Reyes, given your experience in public safety, what are some of the reasons why counties would choose not to use wireless emergency services?
Well, coverage is one of them. In the scenario that you described, while there was allegations of the vendor deliberately throttling back bandwidth, the most significant concern when that's not the issue is just getting coverage in those rural and remote areas. So that's one of them. The other one is overloading of the system because most of us are on commercial wireless networks. When you have a convergence of a lot of mutual aid and lots of first responders, they very quickly overwhelm a commercial wireless system. Whereas if we were to be on a dedicated network like FirstBand, like FirstNet, that should not happen.
Do you have anything to add, Mr. Curry?
Actually, I was just informed this past week by a vendor, by a representative of AT&T. We did buy into the FirstNet system. We're the first county dispatch center in New Jersey to do so. And they assured us that there would be no throttling back on the FirstNet system. As Mr. Reyes said, we do have some coverage issues in the county, but it's early on yet.
Well, how important, Mr. Reyes, do you think it is to have appropriate officials receive the necessary training to administer these alerts then?
Very important. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair recognizes Mr. Guthrie.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to be here, and I have a few questions, and I'm sorry a couple other hearings are going on, so I've been bouncing in and out, and hope I try not to repeat what's already been asked or said. But so these are for Mr. Curry. Do you think states should be required to report the fees they divert to FCC? Right now, the FCC study is voluntary. And is there any other information you don't get to include on the FCC study that you wish you could?
To ensure that the money was being spent the way that the taxpayers expect the money to be paid, I would have to say yes, that there should be FCC oversight.
For the study. And do you think there's some information you would like to include that's not in the study now? Is there additional information?
No, the bill looked to be fairly thorough and complete.
Okay. How does a county in a diverting state with multiple call centers handle this situation? Do they have to choose which call centers to upgrade or which call centers get to hire more staff? Or do they evenly split the funds among the call centers?
Among local call centers in New Jersey, no one has received any money.
No one's seen any money? Okay.
Out of the 11% that was spent on 911, it did not reach the local level.
Didn't get to the county level, okay. And then what are some of the features of your 911 system? What are some of the features your 911 system is missing because you have been unable to upgrade due to financial constraints?
The biggest hurdle we have is caller location. We don't have next-gen 911, and the software is very expensive to purchase this, for us to give us the ability to do that without the next-gen 911.
Okay.
We would have to have an outside vendor provide us with that software.
Okay, appreciate that, and that's my question, so I'll yield back my time.
The chair recognizes Ms. Clark.
I thank Chairman Lance and Ranking Member Doyle for convening this very important hearing on public safety communications. I'm pleased that the subcommittee is considering the Anti-Swatting Act introduced by my colleague and fellow New Yorker, Mr. Engel. Over the past several years, the practice of swatting has increased in prominence. Swatters, who have often been involved in online disputes, make hoax calls to emergency response teams, leading to their deployment. The practice has resulted in wasted law enforcement resources and physical harm, even death, to its unsuspecting victims. So my first question is actually to Captain Starks. I've read stories of Parkland activist David Hogg being the victim of swatting and worry that such techniques may be used to stifle debate and free expression, in addition to all of the other harm that it causes. In your experience, are swatting calls being targeted at particular populations or types of individuals?
Yes, and I don't think it's unique to Montgomery County. It's been schools, where I mentioned it had to be evacuated and housed because of the weather that day, but also people of notoriety as well are targeted, and the intent is to bringing all kinds of resources, and then when you do that, potential dangerous situation to anyone who may be at that location, whether it's a business or residence, with that kind of response.
Is there a psychological profile that is sort of beginning to, come to the fore around individuals who would engage in these swatting tactics?
None that I know of, but it seems just to be a younger population. The example I mentioned where the school was evacuated, I believe the person was a juvenile located outside of this country.
Wow, okay. Law enforcement officers face difficult choices in the best of circumstances, and I'm concerned that swatting calls might be particularly devastating in some minority communities where, unfortunately, there might already be tensions with law enforcement. So, Captain Starks, what can we do to deter swatters and help police officers safely respond to these dangerous hoaxes, regardless of where they're called in?
I think more discussion about this, more education to the public that this is not a joke, it's not a hoax, but it does cause, as has been mentioned, a waste of resources being stripped away from what they would normally be doing. But more importantly, there's a potential danger to anyone on both sides of this issue, the responders and whoever happens to be home. I think the education piece is one part of it, and I think that the components of this legislation are important as well to make it a federal crime, and of particular interest to my ECC director was the cost recovery, where we could provide an accounting, or a local jurisdiction could provide an accounting, and then get those dollars back from the group or an individual who caused it to occur.
Very well. And law enforcement has sometimes had difficulty classifying swatting under current laws. Some cases have resulted in charges related to cyber terrorism, while others have approached the issue as a criminal mischief. How would you classify swatting under our current legal system?
Well, it would be a criminal offense to make a false call in the state of Maryland, make a false, emergency call. But this additional legislation would clearly add more bite to it.
Very well. Some swatters have been convicted under federal criminal statutes. How would Mr. Ingles' bill help law enforcement officers and prosecutors contain the threats posed by swatting?
I think with more specific legislation that has been mentioned, and the ability to have some options depending on the circumstances of the allegations, local, state, or federal, it gives us more options and more advantage over these criminals.
Well, I thank you very much, Captain Starks, and I thank all of our witnesses for your expertise this morning. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Ms. Clark. The chair recognizes Mr. Olson for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair, excuse me, and welcome to our 3 witnesses. Also want to thank y'all for your years, decades of service on the thin blue line. Thank you, thank you, thank you for that. My questions will focus on one big storm, Hurricane Harvey. As y'all know, it hit my hometown, my home region, twice, moving very, very slow. Dropped on average 40 inches of rain in 2 days, almost 4 feet of rain over almost all southeast Texas. 911 was overwhelmed with calls. As Ranking Member Doyle mentioned in his opening statement, people could not get through with the calls. One example I heard back home, a senior citizen, his wife, their home was flooding. They called 911 for about an hour, could not get through. Somehow they planned to go to Chick-fil-A after they were rescued. They made that call to Chick-fil-A, that went through. And for some reason, only known to God and luck, Chick-fil-A showed up and rescued those two people. Mr. Curry, before this hearing, you told me a great story about how big difference between Kingwood, New Jersey and Kingwood, Texas. Apparently during Hurricane Harvey, someone was misrouted from Kingwood, Texas to Kingwood, New Jersey. And your people stuck with this person over and over and got them rescued back home in Kingwood, Texas. So thank you for that again, but that's lucky as opposed to having a plan. I want to talk about the Brooks SU bill, the HR 5700 National Emergency Mobile Number Act. And my hometown of Sugar Land has a 311 system already that opened up last year. I found out at the mayor's big annual State of the City address. It works. About 2 months ago, I'm riding down my street. There's a big branch down the sidewalk. I called up 311. Within hours, that branch is gone. But my neighbors had no clue that 311 was available. No idea it was out there. And so the question is, how can people determine, how do you determine what's a true emergency for 911 and what's a non-emergency for 311? Can callers differentiate between 911 and 311, your opinion, Mr. Reyes, Mr. Curry, and Mr. Starks? What's the challenge there to get them to know what's really an emergency and what's not?
So, sir, we do not have 311 in Prince William County, but from talking to some municipalities that do have 311, they embed in the voice calling options. If you dial 311, for example, when it answers, the voice tree answer says if you have an emergency, press 1, and then it reroutes you over to 911. So that's my only experience with 311, but we are not a 311.
How do you deal with Chick-fil-A calling up you guys at 911? How do you deal with that situation? How do you get them off your line? Because that's clearly not an emergency.
Well, that happens on our 10-digit non-emergency. So our county has a 10-digit non-emergency number that the county residents use. And so when they dial 911 and it's a non-emergency call, our call takers divert them to the non-emergency calls internally. And then we're doing an education program within our county at the school level where we're reaching out to kids. We just awarded 4 kids on Saturday awards for making the right call because in school they learned the awesome power of 911 and how to use it properly. So I think we got to do something similar with the non-emergency number.
Great. Mr. Curry, your comments on?
Because we handle all the phone calls for each municipal police agency in Hunterdon County, if somebody were to call on the non-emergency, and they do, they call in a non-emergency 10-digit number, because all the calls come to the same center, it wouldn't be an issue for us.
Yep.
Because the same dispatchers who take the 911 calls they're in that same room, and they can just as easily handle that 311, for example. And we're going to take the same number of calls if it's 911, 311, or the 10-digit number, because if they're going to call, they're going to call. It's just a matter of the method in which they decide to use and what's most beneficial for them and what's most beneficial for us.
Captain Starks.
Like Mr. Reyes, we have a 10-digit non-emergency number, but getting that number in people's heads is very, very tough. And 911 is just so much easier to remember. The county has started a 311 line. It's separate from our emergency call center, and it's a very deliberate process. But like Mr. Reyes said at the beginning, if you think you have an emergency, that message is given and it directs people to the 911.
About out of time, I have one question remaining about the Anti-Swatting Act, and this is for all 3 witnesses, a simple yes or no answer. I just want to ensure that H.R. 6003, the Anti-Swatting Act, has no effect on my Houston Astros swatting the heck out of the American League rivals and National League champion en route to a repeat of a World Series. Does this affect my Houston Astros swatting the National League and the American League?
No.
I would think not.
Sir.
There you go. That's what I want to hear. I yield back.
Your time is expired, Mr. Olson. Mr. Engel, you're recognized.
Thank you, and let me tell my friend and colleague, Mr. Olson, that the Bill 6003, the Anti-Swatting Act, is my bill, and you don't have to worry the New York Yankees are going to swat all the other teams.
Repeat.
So thank you, Chairman Lance and Ranking Member Doyle, for holding today's hearing and including my bill, the Anti-Swatting Act 6003. And I want to thank Yvette Clark for highlighting some of the things of that bill. According to the FBI, a single SWAT team deployment can cost thousands of taxpayers' dollars. It obviously wastes law enforcement's time, which prevents them from responding to real emergencies. And most importantly, it risks injury to unassuming victims as well as to the officials who mount a response. One of the most tragic examples took place last December in Wichita, Kansas, where officers shot and killed an unarmed 28-year-old man on his front doorstep after receiving a phony call alleging an ongoing crime. It's a very serious problem, and that's why we introduced this bill to address it. My bill would expand on the Truth in Caller ID Act that Chairman Emeritus Joe Barton and I introduced and had signed into law in 2010. And last Congress, my Anti-Swatting Act was amended and favorably reported out of our committee, but it did not come up for a vote on the floor. So we have a real opportunity now. The current version of my bill includes the amendments we passed last Congress, and in short, my Anti-Swatting Act would increase penalties for people who falsify their caller ID information to mislead law enforcement. This technological trick called spoofing allows swatters to hide their identity by making law enforcement believe they are calling in an emergency from a different phone booth, different phone number or location. The bill would also force swatters to reimburse emergency service entities for the resources they spend responding to the invented emergency. So I'd like to ask Captain Starks or anybody else who would care to answer. When law enforcement receives a swatting call, you obviously don't know when you receive it that it's phony, that it's fake. Can you explain how law enforcement responds to such a call?
Sure. The people in the 911 center have to begin vetting some of the details of that call as they're being dispatched to the first responders. Usually a swatting call has some details regarding violence, where the caller states that maybe he or she has already shot someone, is there with a higher powered weapon, that kind of thing. Someone else is in danger. So that activates not only the first cops in the street responding, but also tactical units, negotiators who come, and then fire and rescue services who have to come by and respond to treat who may be injured there and who may become injured there as well. So it's wave after wave after wave of affecting public safety.
You know, it's really a sick thing. You know, it's you'd wonder what kind of fool would do something like this. It's just absolutely mind-boggling, with total, you know, to play a joke or to get a kick out of something, to really put people's lives in jeopardy is just absolutely disgraceful. Swatting incidents have profound impacts on families too. I'm sure you would agree with that.
Absolutely.
My bill calls for increased penalties for swatting, including up to 20 years, where the emergency response results in serious bodily injury. Violators would also be required to reimburse law enforcement entities for their expenses, which is another thing, in responding to the hoax. In your opinion, will that help?
Yes, it will.
Okay. Thank you very much, and thank you for the good work you do. I don't know if Mr. Reyes and Mr. Curry have any comments.
The only thing I would add to what we all have discussed here on the swatting thing is something that's often overlooked, is that oftentimes these could be diverted actions to divert law enforcement attention from perhaps another real-life crime that's going to be taking place, like a bank robbery, for example. So that's one of the things. And then on a much bigger scale, I don't think we should minimize the importance that this plays to homeland security issues around the country. What if this is just some rehearsals for these would-be homeland terrorists that are just seeing how responders are going to be responding so that they can then prepare for a larger real-life attack?
Well, two very good points. Thank you, and thank all three of you. We appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The chair recognizes Mr. Bilirakis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it, and I welcome the witnesses. Thank you for their testimony. I was actually downstairs at the hearing, so we have two going on at once. I also want to acknowledge my constituent, a paramedic, Maya Daniels, who was recognized as a local first responder of the year for going above and beyond. Thank you for your service, gentlemen. I appreciate it so very much. Moving on to questions, I want to address an issue related to the Anti-Swatting Act. I know this has been discussed, but I have a specific question here, which is impacting, of course, our general population. The number of spam calls to Americans has increased from about 4% of the calls in 2017 to about 29% this year. And now a new report from First Irion projects that 45% of all cell calls will be from scammers in 2019. It's unacceptable, just awful. My question is for both of you. Are you seeing significant increases in fake emergency calls to your public safety systems or non-emergency response lines, regardless of whether they are purposeful swatting calls or spoof calls? And will the bills being discussed today protect against these threats? And we'll start with Mr. Curry, if that's okay.
I don't have any empirical data. I can say anecdotally they're on the increase. I've been in this particular position for a couple years now. And as I said, I think we had one just a few months ago, an actual swatting call. So again, I would say that they're on the rise. But again, I don't have data to back.
What about the bills that are being discussed today? Will they make a difference?
I hope so.
In your opinion?
I would hope that they would.
Okay, very good. Anyone else want to touch that? Any questions?
Thank you, Captain Stark. So just like Mr. Curry, I don't have any empirical data either, but there's definitely steady in our municipality. While they may not be on the increase, they're definitely constant. So that's one of the things. The three bills that we're talking about here today, I think will have a significant positive impact on the job that we do every single day.
Good, good, good. And again, if you have any input on how we can improve, in addition to those three bills, please don't hesitate. I guess it's Mr. Stark.
Just to echo what's been said, is that this legislation, I think Mr. Pallone in his statement said this will also help keep first responders safer. And if first responders are safer, to include call takers and dispatchers, then we can do our job better in protecting the public.
Very good, thank you. Mr. Curry, in your testimony, you mentioned that finding a caller's location is determined through manual entries and interrogation. Do you have any estimate on how long it typically takes to get an accurate emergency location? Or worse, are there situations where a location cannot be identified? And can you explain how the next generation 911 will help bring down these numbers?
If there's any delay at all, that's a problem because seconds count. So if it's just a couple of seconds to locate where the caller is, that's an issue. The other problem is I'd mentioned that we have a major interstate. People call 911 because again that's the universal number to call, and they're moving. So as they're moving, we're still trying to track their location, which is very difficult, and it has to be done through manual entry. And again, as I mentioned, through interrogation. We get a lot of transient traffic, and they just don't know where they are. I couldn't tell you how long it takes on an average, but the next gen 911 and some of this other software I'd mentioned before would actually put the person's location within, I want to say, about 3 meters, and it would do it quickly and continuously.
Very good. Thank you. And again, thank you for your service. Appreciate it. Thanks for putting your lives on the line to protect us, and we need to be as helpful as we possibly can. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. The chair recognizes Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank you, gentlemen, for your service. Thanks for being here today. Mr. Reyes and Captain Starks, shifting gears just a little bit, what are some of the most extreme or alarming circumstances where someone called 911 where they should have called a non-emergency number? You got any examples? Mr. Reyes, you can go first.
When I was in Alexandria, the most extreme call that I recall was a resident who called asking for a medic unit because they had run out of aspirin and they wanted an ambulance to take them to the hospital. They used 911 for that. So that's an extreme example that I can give you.
Yeah.
And that happens pretty regularly across centers across America.
Captain Starks?
Generally, the abuse is calls for normal county or government services for like snow or leaves, or just they're using it as 411, so like asking questions instead of needing emergency services right away. There's a finite number of 911 lines in any emergency center, and in that case, that line is being held up, not being able to be used for any incoming emergency.
Okay. Have you noticed a higher number of these calls coming from out-of-state travelers? Any correlation there?
You mean the calls that come into 911 that should not be?
Yeah, that should go to a non-emergency number.
Yes. So just like Mr. Curry, we have a major interstate running through our county, I-95, and that generates a lot of traffic, as well as a large shopping complex known as Potomac Mills, and that generates a lot of visitors and tourists as well. And just like Captain Starks indicated, oftentimes rather than look for the 10-digit emergency number, or quite frankly, not even knowing what municipality they're in, everyone knows that the universal number that's always going to get answered, no matter what square foot in America you're in, is going to be 911. So that seems to be the default number when people have a question, don't know who to ask.
Do you think they knew to call a non-emergency number but just didn't have or know how to locate the non-emergency number? And do you think they would have called it if we had a nationwide standardized non-emergency number? You think that would have helped?
I can only suspect, yes, because I mean some of the calls that we receive that are clearly non-emergency that come into the emergency line are just at the common sense perspective, though that person should have clearly known not to dial 911, but yet they're asking for directions to wherever they're trying to go, and so they know that the de facto number that's always going to get answered is 911.
Okay. Cam Starks?
I would just echo the same for the sake of time.
Okay. Continuing on this same thought, one potential criticism of a broader uniform non-emergency mobile number is the consumer education that would have to take place to inform citizens of its existence. Some states have already got such a number, and so that creates a potentially even greater need to standardize the process so that someone driving from one state to the next doesn't have to worry about knowing multiple numbers across the nation. What are some of the benefits, gentlemen, of having a nationwide non-emergency number like that?
Well, I'll start, and again, it would be to take that unnecessary and unjustified volume of calls that come into 911 to a dedicated number.
Yeah.
But again, just like all these very successful campaigns that we have used, like Buckle Up, things like that, where we teach children and start teaching at a very young age and start teaching our residents the importance of the number, then we can start focusing on a number. But like Mr. Curry said, in one state, there could be up to three-digit numbers, and so the citizens get confused and don't know which one to call number one or for what type of event to use that number for.
Either of you gentlemen want anything more to add to that?
I just believe that, in the 70s, we went to the 911 system. We didn't have any type of resources like we have now to communicate campaigns like the internet and social media and that type of thing. It's about, I think, education and changing the culture. It's been, in my career, over 30 years, just the way drunk driving is viewed now in this country. That's changed. It's just taken a while. The same thing can happen, but I think a lot quicker with a standardized non-emergency number.
Okay. All right. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johnson. The chair recognizes Ms. Brooks.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to continue on this line of questioning about the bill that I introduced regarding non-emergency numbers. And I want to ask you, Captain Starks, you talked about, so in your career, you've seen how 911 has become so successful. How do you have examples of how the public does have a good understanding of the use of non-emergency numbers in some of the states that do have it?
I don't have any examples from out of state. I think that within my jurisdiction, Montgomery County, there is some understanding, but I think there's a great deal of confusion and just ignorance or lack of knowledge in regarding this 10-digit non-emergency number that we employ.
And so would it be fair to say that you would like to see a shorter number that, because so many people go from one community to another in the area that you represent, if we had a very simple 3-digit number, wouldn't that be incredibly advantageous?
It sure would be in the first look, but Mr. Reyes also spoke earlier, just cautionary about making sure that funding and staffing is there, because it is going to cause an increase of calls to the center. But yes, a uniform number would be helpful.
And Mr. Reyes, going back, and I appreciate, I visited my PSAP in Indiana, in Hamilton County, and certainly appreciate what the concern is about resources. But do we have any data from the 911, from the PSAPs, how many calls right now come in that are non-emergency versus emergency?
Yes, ma'am. During my opening remarks, I gave that statistic for our agency, and our organization receives more non-emergency calls than emergency calls. Overall, we're at 400,000 calls total, and of those 400,000, some 254,000 were non-emergency.
And so would you agree that if we had if there were resources as well as a public education campaign,
Yeah.
much like what we've done, and I think it is much easier now because of social media and smartphones, to be able to communicate what that number would be if a person, wanted to use a non-emergency number?
Yes.
If you don't mind, if I could just add to that.
Please.
In Hunterdon County, where I live, my post office isn't even in my county. So we have postal mailing addresses that expand way beyond where you may think you live. In addition to that, about 1/3 of our county is covered by the state police, and that's 3 different state police barracks. People don't know who their police agencies are, let alone know the number to call for a non-emergency. So I know we've talked about, the nationwide scale, but for me, it's more important on a local level.
So it's even a local, not just the traveling, because I've been told that if a person were driving, we have no fewer than 18 different abbreviated short codes across 29 states. If a person were driving across Highway 95, they would even see 10 different dialing codes.
Yes.
And so it's impossible for for just a citizen to be driving, even on an interstate system, and know who to call if they saw a tree down or a dead deer along the side of the road. I mean, things that might not be a true emergency. And yet the 911 operators and folks, dispatchers rather, that I'm speaking with, are very concerned about making sure they have the time and the bandwidth to handle the true emergency calls, because those are the ones that really deserve their attention. Would you agree?
Yes.
And do we have many situations documented of, people being on hold for 911 for quite some time when they have true emergencies? Do we have that documented as well?
We don't document that in our jurisdiction.
I don't have the data, but I know that it has occurred within Montgomery County.
And how about you, Mr. Curry?
This past early spring, late winter, we had 2 storms come through, Quinn and Riley. And the way our 911 system works is if it doesn't get answered in one PSAP, it goes to the next and it bounces. And during one particular storm, we received over 200 911 calls from the previous county, and even a handful of calls from 2 counties before that. A lot of those calls were just that, my power's out.
Okay, and so therefore, your dispatchers are taking all those calls in, whereas if someone had horrific wreck or something during that storm, they could have been on hold.
Correct, and some of those were emergencies that we were getting those redundant calls from.
Okay. Thank you. Appreciate it, and yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Brooks. Seeing there are no further members wishing to ask questions for the panel, I thank our witnesses for being here today. Before we conclude, I ask unanimous consent to enter the following documents into the record. A letter from the Hunterdon County Freeholders in support of H.R. 6424, an article on 911 fee diversion in New Jersey, and an article from the New York Times offered by Mr. Doyle. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record, and I ask that witnesses submit their responses within 10 business days upon receipt of the questions. Seeing no further business before the subcommittee today, without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned.